Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today to hear about what I've been working on in my research project. Thank you to ASC for this opportunity to share what we've been working on as well. So I'm coming to you from Perth in Western Australia, which is Wajak Noongar land. I have my cocker cup with me, keep me smiling. So at the University of Western Australia, I've been working with Dr. Heather Bray and Dr. Miriam Sullivan as my supervisors. And I have recently changed the name of my research as it's been progressing. So I've moved away from issues of barriers and obstacles, and I'm looking at inclusion in citizen science, considering volunteers with disabilities and with different abilities. Now, all right, so a little bit about me. I did my undergraduate degree at UWA in science communication and botany. And these are some pictures from my working life. I spent quite a few years working in Kings Park. I also did some communication work at the Equal Opportunity Commission, and I currently work at Water Corporation in education and outreach, working a lot with advanced water recycling and groundwater replenishment with our challenging drying climate. And I work with the International Centre for Radio Astronomy Research and on the AstroFest Astronomy Festival. So I come from a background of engagement and inclusion, so they're the two areas that I really wanted to explore. So I'm actually quite interested and passionate about citizen science the more and more I've looked at it. And there were three reasons why I chose this to look into. The first one, the one I've put in the middle, citizen science really has this great opportunity for a more two-way dialogue and engagement with people in the citizen science projects. To the left, citizen science often works on projects and cycles, so that provides opportunities for evaluation and reflection and modifications. And then on the right, citizen science often works in local areas, so has community issues that are really important to people that they engage with. So then I had a bit of a deeper dive, look into why does inclusion matter? And we know very clearly that in workplaces, inclusion and diversity produces better results. We know that inclusion of people in science is important for knowledge, information, and better outcomes. Including people in the issue of science communication, it's really important that people have understanding of science for everyday life decisions such as vaccines. And we also even know that in citizen science, to get more or better samples or more diversity of samples for truer understanding of what's actually happening, we need more diverse groups to be taking those samples. Now, we do know that we don't reach everyone in science engagement, and there's specifically groups of people historically that haven't been included in science. And we know that still today, these groups aren't appropriately or adequately represented in science. One of our biggest ones that we see in STEM is getting more women into STEM education and professions, but also there's different cultural and socio or education groups that aren't adequately represented. And it's not always a matter of just making them available. These issues have become quite complex, that often these groups feel that they're not included or that science isn't for them. Now, one of the groups that really I found particularly interesting is people living with a disability. And that was for several reasons. Actually, the statistics say that 20% of the Australian population live with some form of a disability. It's about 15% in the younger population, up to about 25% in the older generations. But a disability can actually happen to any one of us at any time. So it wasn't so much the us and them, it is something that can happen to anyone. And also just personally, I thought that people living with a disability might be a slightly less, a less complex and a more simple way of looking at abilities that are inhibiting engagement with science, because there's some very clear statistics around people living with disabilities through education, that their participation in science is reduced, and it's called the leaky pipeline in science. And it goes right down through the education system, but to professionals working in science, it can be as low as 3% of scientists live with a disability, which is not proportional or representative of our population. So the aims of my research were two specifically. One are, what are the experiences of practitioners of citizen science programs in Australia of volunteers with a disability? And I did choose to specifically look at people working within citizen science programs, because the evidence showed that they were the people that could make the biggest impact or the most difference. And then, with the knowledge and understanding we have, how can citizen science programs be designed to be inclusive of volunteers with a disability? So the way I approached this is I looked at qualitative research, and then I looked at two types of approaches to do this. One's called the advocacy and collaborative approach, and the other one, the constructivism. And it was really about talking with these practitioners in citizen science programs and constructing meaning from their experiences and working with them collaboratively to come up with understanding of what's happening. And so I did this through semi-structured interviews. And then to develop those interviews, we actually sought advice. We got on board a disability advocate for our program. We did consult with various citizen science practitioners as well to develop our interview script. We applied for ethics approval through the University of Western Australia. And interestingly, one of the things that they brought to our attention was that we needed a distress protocol, asking the questions that we were with the issues that we were exploring. And there's a reference here of an excellent distress protocol we found. And actually, I did end up using this at one point with one of my interviewees that had a disability herself and began to share some of her issues and became distressed. So this was very important. So the research group, we looked at, we recruited managers and coordinators of citizen science programs. We did a recruitment drive. Maybe some of you saw it through social media channels or newsletters, through the Australian Science Communicators and the Australian Citizen Science Association networks. And we had 14 volunteers who agreed to be interviewed, and they came from a diverse cross-section of different professionals in citizen science, from PhD students that were working to help coordinate programs, right through to researchers and different communication professionals. So we developed 15 different questions. We then interviewed, the interviews were recorded through auto transcriptions, and everything in these interviews was completely de-identified. So if they mentioned a species or a project or a location or a name, all those things were taken out so that the interviewees felt and they were let them know that they could speak openly about their experiences. So data analysis, I actually used in vivo thematic analysis software, and I used a system of inductive coding like Lucy, or very similar to Lucy, with this qualitative research. I was going through the experiences and the information shared by the interviewees, looking and coding relevant information that they were sharing, and then collating that and sorting that to come up with themes in the information they were providing. So as an overview of the results, there were 14 interviews in total. They came from a diverse section demographic of professionals. There was a great diversity of sciences, from marine biology to astronomy, and different types of citizen science projects. Some were entirely online. There were many different types of projects that were doing field work. So we tried to get a good cross-section to show us what was happening. And there tended to be three main things that came up. One was all except for three participants said that they'd never thought about people living with a disability in their programs and that it just hadn't come up as an issue. Another thing was that a lot of the interviewees said that there was an inherent nature to their activities, and these requirements really meant that a lot of people, if they could or couldn't do it, it was up to them. And another interesting thing that came up, and I don't know if it was necessarily the intention, but it came up in every interview. And it was, well, what about this group? Or what about that group? Or I've thought about this, or I've thought about that. And it's actually coming up as a term now, whataboutism. And it's where issues come up and it's almost like, well, these issues are too big and there's a lot of other groups as well. So, you know, how can I be expected to look at this one? So the two main obstacles really came up were, and this was quite significant, in almost every interview, in these practitioners that were working with multiple projects over many years throughout all around Australia, only one said that they had one participant actually speak up. A volunteer said that they had a disability. And the interviewees even said the large volumes of people they're dealing with and the statistics show us that there are people living with disabilities, but they're just not speaking up. So they're either not there. And the second thing is, and this has really come up with citizen science, is there's a real it's a volunteering culture of opt-in or opt-out. So a lot of the practitioners thought that people with a disability must think that they just aren't able to do those activities. So they decide for themselves that they can't participate. So there are some things that were working well in the citizen science projects. One example was where a participant brought a citizen science project out to a scout group and was specifically asking the scout group and the parents, what are your needs? What do you need to be able to do these activities? This also happened with another professional who went to a school of special needs and went to these classes and said, what do you need to be able to do these projects? And they could express really well, we need the instructions to be really simplified. They need to be super simple. And that actually helped the program quite a lot because they were able to simplify their instructions that helped it for everyone else. A lot of these programs will make adaptations when people bring them up, such as paper alternatives when there's issues with technology. And then successes that they were finding was when they found, this was the same example, when information needed to be simpler and clearer to understand, such as the school with special needs, it helps other groups as well, such as people that are participating whose English is a second language. So it was really about listening to advice that was coming from participants about what they needed and applying them. And then a flexibility and willingness to make adaptations when they're identified. So one example was when a volunteer said, I have a friend who's in a wheelchair. Could we do observations in our backyards? And the program was able to adapt that observation area to their backyard. And it's really about being able and having that flexibility to make adaptations when they're brought up. So why is this important in citizen science specifically? There's three quite important areas that became relevant through the literature. One is retention of volunteers. Citizen science will often struggle to retain volunteers and they can lose up to 80% of them in a project. So a lot of the practitioners said if we could get people of different abilities who were keen to stay on, that would be really important and they would adapt to them. Another thing that happens in citizen science is there can be these sort of monogroups of people who are the same that start to collect high volumes of data, and that produces a lack of diversity in the data that's being collected. And then there's also, and another important issue that's coming up is about inclusion in the community. So especially when these are local issues, it's very important that the people in the community are able to participate in those issues around them. So expected issues that didn't appear, there were a few. We know a lot in the literature, it comes up that people with a disability have different challenges that make them feel like they don't belong or that this isn't for them. It was only assumed that might be. There wasn't that level of communication or visibility to see that that was actually happening. The fact that they feel they might not be able to do the activity, that wasn't even being communicated. And really the practitioners weren't even seeing reasons why people with disabilities weren't appearing in the projects or speaking up. The implications: by improving participation and diversity and inclusion, we can enrich data collection for citizen science. We know through universal design that whenever we improve something for one group, it makes everyone else feel more welcome, more included, and it easier for them. And another thing is that citizen science can really be an example that science communication can learn from in the future. So 3 main recommendations that came out of my research is one, and this came from the practitioners themselves, is that many of these projects have different activities within their projects. So if they can be making those different activities available for the volunteers and participants, it really caters for diverse skills and abilities, not just of people living with disabilities, but people of different skills and abilities. Another thing that became really important, and they brought up with everybody that has time constraints, is actually making the time to consider inclusion in the design stage and making activities that they can be adaptable when possible when things come up. And most of the practitioners suggested improving communication about what the requirements of those activities are, but also inviting people to tell them what they need to be able to participate. So the conclusion from my research has been 2 things. Due to historical biases, inclusion needs to be proactively applied, and we can see this in citizen science. Making things accessible online, thinking that we're taking away a barrier, is not enough for these people, for different groups such as people living with a disability, to participate. They actually need to be invited and assisted. And citizen science could be an ideal tool to lead the way in these inclusive practices, but we can see that there's still a long way to go. So thank you for listening to my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Can we give Tam a Zoom round of applause, please, everybody? That was really, really, really interesting. Really interesting. I think it's one of those things where inclusion can only really ever be a good thing. I love it. I have a few questions. There's one that's popped up in chat as well. If you all have questions as well for Tam, please put them down in the chat as well. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but my dog is very sad. Oh, anyway. So apologies. So Joanna wants to know, now that you're finishing this research, how do we get this information out there? So to people who are running events and citizen science programs, how do we get event organisers to think more about this kind of thing?
Okay, so different things have come up. One of the things I did is produce a 1-pager resource of different websites and tools that can be really easily applied for events and different communication activities. So I will share that and we can add it online for our members.
Please do.
And one of the other things that was coming up was just talking about and doing this research was creating awareness with these practitioners. And all of them said they'll think differently now about how they include people and think about people living with a disability in their activities. And super interesting, the Australian Citizen Science Association is now going to run a workshop in including people with disabilities in citizen science programs. So just talking about it and bringing a level of awareness makes a big difference. And
that's fantastic.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. What are your thoughts about, Joanna just said we need to get the ASE in on it. Yes, we do. We will have a chat. You mentioned that one of the big things that came out for you was that people running these events generally just don't consider people with disabilities, and kind of had the whataboutism reaction. What are your thoughts about how we go about changing that way of thinking? I mean, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit before about even just talking about it is helpful. But are there any practical ways that you think we might be able to change that?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to information and professional development. So most of these practitioners said they hadn't had any professional development, and they even wanted more information, and they didn't know how to include it. All of them expressed citizen science projects usually run on tight budgets and tight timeframes, and so there was a lot of pressure, and that, you know, at that initial stage of any type of program or event, making that time to really look at inclusion. You know, who's our target audience? You know, and how are we going to get these people, make it easy for them to participate? How are we going to welcome them? How are we going to invite them? There's a really interesting quote, and I can put a reference to it as well, that I should have written it down, but it's Heather's laughing at me right now. Why didn't you write this down? But it's saying diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. But there's another one, and I do have it written down somewhere, but there's another bit where belonging is actually being able to say, but I can't dance. And it's still okay. You can still hang out at and you still belong.
Oh, I really like that. That's great. Yeah. Tom's got a question in the chat here. I'm really interested in the positive impact the ethics approval had on your project. So it feels like this is a rare experience. How do we change the perception of ethics approvals?
So Tom, what do you mean by perception of ethics approvals? Is that they're big and scary and people don't do them?
Yeah, they're a huge barrier to achieving anything. The idea of an ethics approval scares private practice away, because they're like, universities can deal with that. It's not something that they opt in to do. Yeah, so having to pass your research past an ethics board, I think, is something that's seen as I have to do.
I can see that perspective, but from my perspective as an honours student going into research, I felt like the ethics approval actually had my back. And that by going there and getting them to review it, and of course they picked up like a huge list of all these little things we had to change. This actually took a really long time. But also they came up with a distress protocol, you know, as I mentioned. And that was really important, because I knew that it could happen. But it still took me by surprise that I ended up having one of my interviewers burst out crying during my interview and become quite distressed. And I knew it could happen, but by having that distress protocol, I was actually able to change the conversation and focus on proactively what they were doing and getting them to talk. And the interview ended quite well. And I'm still quite engaged with this participant. So I feel like the ethics committee had my back. And so it's actually assist you in what you're doing. So it's really a different perspective.
Yeah, definitely. This might be putting you on the spot, and please feel free to not answer this question if you don't think it's appropriate. But can you maybe give us an example of a program that you think is doing is including people with disabilities really well, and kind of what they're doing? And did you come across anything that in your...
Yes, I did. And all of my practitioners and projects have an anonymity.
Yes.
So I can't actually talk about the people who volunteered and the
totally fine.
But I can give information more generally. So there are projects that, and there was one in particular that actually did take more time to discuss and consult. And then they were actually doing it as they were going along. So things would come up that they hadn't thought about, and then they adapted. And they were able to do things like going, oh, well, this is a group we haven't considered, but these are important. And they were able to get some funding for somewhere else and run a series of workshops specifically for this group, both to train them and to learn and the program assimilate and learn from them. So there are projects doing it. And I've got to say that all the 14 practitioners had a really good will and were really passionate about what they were working on and really wanted to include people. There was no one at any point that said, oh, why does this even matter? So there's a real desire, I found, and even in the Australian Citizen Science Association, to improve what we're doing.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Thank you for that. I have one more question for you. You mentioned before that the insights that you got from your research would help inform other areas of science communication practice. Do you have any kind of insights on how that might work?
Well, I think with citizen science, the fact that they're really on the ground in a lot of ways, and they're going out into communities and they're going out to groups of people, when we can see good examples of how they're really considering, welcoming and having open invitations for different diverse groups or people with disabilities, ways that they're making adaptations, and also making different activities available. Sometimes in science communication, we can think about certain things we want to do and outcomes, but maybe not everyone can do that. But there's different parts of different activities we do. So I think citizen science was often saying that there's these different activities in their programs, and we could be doing that as citizen science, science communication as well. When we're looking at activities, well, everybody has different skills and abilities, and some people have disabilities. So what can I make available for different people?
Great. Amazing. Does anybody have any other questions? Type them down in the chat. This was a really interesting talk. It's given me a lot of brain ideas. Yes, I work in a science museum here in Wollongong, so this is very, yes, I have many ideas. Okay, amazing. I don't think we have any more questions, so I think
can I ask, sorry Joe, I'm just quickly jumping in. I can't type fast enough. Tamara, do you think that there's scope for adopting some of the outcomes from your work in a set of guidelines that go alongside funding grant schemes? So there are grants that go out from national grants from Australian government for citizen science projects to go ahead and things like that. And we knew from the Centres of Excellence, for instance, that communications officers were funded as part of the development of the CRCs. That kind of policy aspect can be really influential in implementing best practice. I'm just wondering whether or not you think that there's a scope for adopting a set of overlying like grounding principles in inclusion practice of citizen science.
Yeah, very much so, because even sort of the foundation principle of citizen science is that it is inclusive and it is in the community and anyone can do it. And we know that that isn't always the case, but especially when we talk about actually writing grant applications, very much so, that's the set of guidelines that can be incorporated and say, but this is how we're going to be inclusive, rather than just assuming it, saying this is what we're going to do. And I think very much that's not commonly done, and it would enrich any grant application. And one example is the Australian Citizen Science Association, who's doing their workshop on including people with disabilities. That would be a great sort of point where they could develop the guidelines, and they're getting different speakers from different areas that they can put together something like that guideline that can then be used in grant applications. How does that sound?
Thank you. Yeah. No, it's always useful to be thinking about those kinds of places where you can prod a policy over here to be able to get a good outcome over there. So yeah.
All right. Very interesting. That's very much the sort of how we're going to put this into practice. How we're going to really put in those guidelines and use them to give direction to our project and implement those inclusion practices. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone.